Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Henry. Afternoon, everybody. Sorry, it's 1 o'clock. Let me just put on my timer just so I get my timers right, my timing right, and I don't stay on waffling too long, just so that we have enough time to answer questions, etc. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Henry Davis. So a little bit about myself. I first started property in London in the early 90s. I studied public relations, management, and I did a MBA in Smurfit Graduate School. I'm also the author of a book called The Truth About Property. That gives you an insight. It's an honest insight, I believe, into what's really going on in the property business. And I hope you will enjoy it if you do decide to buy it. I'm also the presenter of 2 NRLA training courses. One is called Property Refurbishment and one is called The Key to Property Investment. And if you just search those keywords, they will come up on Google. They're actually on a 20% offer at the moment with the NRLA, and both of those courses are the NRLA's top selling courses. So going to cut to the chase and go right into it and focus on some of the common problems that I would say that the biggest mistakes that investors make, and probably one of the biggest areas is basically getting a bad tenant. You know, and why do we get a bad tenant? Well, we sometimes get bad tenants because we haven't done our due diligence correctly. So we haven't really done enough background on the tenants. So to help you with this, there is an NRLA checklist, and I'll show you this further on the slide. Basically, this is the checklist. If you go onto the NRLA website and type in the word checklist, that will give you everything you need to know to make sure you're compliant. So it's very important that if you're not compliant from the start, then if you do have to issue what's called a Section 8 or a Section 21, you know, you're in a weaker position if you haven't done everything in compliance with issuing a tenancy. Like, for example, you have to email people a copy of How to Rent in England, the How to Rent guide. You have to provide a copy of your EPC, your EIHRC, etc. So there's various documents that you have to give to a tenant at the start of a tenancy. So when I'm, you know, interviewing tenants as well, I always want to get a bit of a feel for tenants. And in my case, most agencies and most landlords will ask on the application for the next of kin. Now, in my case, I like the next of kin to be a parent, because if tenants get in any problems, then inevitably sometimes they tend to disappear. And if you have a parent's number, it makes life a lot easier, basically, to find people if you've got the tenant's contact name. Another big issue I find in terms of HMOs and student HMOs is that basically what some landlords do is they have properties in close to student areas, but not right in the heart of student areas. So if you want to have a student HMO, there's certain areas where students want to be, and you have to be in those areas. And the best way to find out that is by simply contacting, you know, local estate agents and saying to them, where do I need to be if I'm renting to students? In terms of generally HMOs, a big issue as well is if you've got a HMO in an area that attracts transient tenants, then it's going to be a problem, and transient tenants are an issue. And you know, you have to, on the one hand, pick a decent area, but if the area is too good, then the figures will never add up. So you have to find what's called a compromise area. This is an area where you have decent quality tenants, but also the figures add up. So another big issue in terms of big mistakes that investors make is they tend to start the due diligence really when they've exchanged contracts. So when you agree sale, the first person I call is obviously my solicitor, my architect if I'm doing a development, my quantity surveyor would be a key member of my team, my planner if necessary. And I try to do all my due diligence as soon as possible, as soon as the deal is agreed. That way, I'm much more understanding of the deal before exchange of contracts. So once I've agreed the deal, as far as I'm concerned, I've exchanged contracts and I'm instantly trying to get as much due diligence done as possible. Now, in the case of an auction property, that will be more challenging. But in my case, what I would normally do if a property is coming up for the auction for sale, I would normally just go and have my own unofficial viewing before the official auction viewing. I would just simply turn up at the property and try and get access, ask who's ever at the property at the time to give me access. Or if it's a public access, I would just go in and have a look around myself around the grounds of the property, etc. So it's all about starting your due diligence as early as possible. And if you're buying at the auction, then if you've done it that way, what will happen is then you'll have done quite a bit of due diligence, if I can say the word, before your first viewing. And then on the first official viewing, you can bring your architect or your quantity surveyor or your professionals, etc. So another big issue as well is, as investors, really, you've got to decide to yourself, are you retail price or are you trade price? So I would typically sell properties to investors and they would hopefully make money in these properties, but they're relying on the market increasing. So they're buying a property on a long-term basis, hoping, yes, prices are going to go up, but they haven't created any value inside the deal. So in order to progress and not run out of your deposit money, you really need to create value in each deal. And how do you do that? Well, the best way to do that is buying a derelict property. And the reason I say derelict is because you can start from scratch and you'll have a really high quality product after that, with hopefully a much higher EPC rating. And obviously EPCs is something I'm going to discuss further on in today's presentation. Okay, another big issue as well is not involving your quantity surveyor to control and manage any projects. So when I start a project, the first person I contact is not my builder, but it's my quantity surveyor. And he will come in and do a full bill of quantities. He will do full detailed spreadsheets of everything that's required. He will scope out the project. And basically, it means that I understand the true costs of the project before I even contact any builder. And this is something I discuss in my property refurbishment course, which I present for the NRLA. Okay, so an example of a typical project going wrong is this. What would happen in a project, say, where it's £100,000 value and you've agreed 5 payments of £20,000 each with a builder? So what typically would happen is, if you don't have the QS involved, then the builder will issue an invoice for £20,000. But how do you know he's actually done that amount of work? And what often happens in practice is that you'll get an invoice for £20,000, as showing on the slide there, but you'll actually have, the builder may only have actually done £15,000 of work. But you can't argue with the builder because you're not a professional. So what you'll do is you'll get your quantity surveyor in, and he will then value each invoice. And what you'll find is that builders listen to quantity surveyors. And that way, you know, each time you get an invoice, you've actually, for 20,000 in this case, you've got £20,000 worth of work. Because otherwise what will happen is the developer will definitely send you an invoice for 20,000. But in my 30 years, I've never once received an invoice that was completely accurate. So, and once you start paying for work that hasn't been done, effectively what's happening is you're paying in advance. And then once you pay in advance, effectively you're losing control of the whole project. So that's the checklist from slide 1. If you remember, I mentioned the NRLA checklist, and that will confirm that you're compliant in terms of issuing your tenancies, new tenancies. Okay, so many people have asked me over the years, what's the best model in terms of profit and the easiest model? Well, the best HMO model, it's not students, it's not renting to professionals, it's actually renting to a supported living provider. And this is a supported living, which usually means that this wouldn't be local housing authority rates or housing association. This will usually be a provider who has staff on site to support people. And these tend to sign longer term leases or license agreement. They often usually have staff on 24 hours a day. So there's always somebody there to look after your property. Now, each requirement provider has different rules basically, but a HMO rented to a care provider or the right type of housing association supported living is the ultimate cash flowing business. And the reason I say that is because they will sign a lease, but the key thing here is they will pay for your maintenance and your utility bills. And you will get market rent plus they will pay for maintenance and utility. So it really is the only hands-on proper business model if you want to be hands-on in property. So in terms of student HMOs and generally speaking HMOs, what you'll find in the UK at the moment, that a single let property on a 70% loan to value, it's really not viable anymore after all your costs. And most of us get 70% loan to value. So, you know, HMOs work, but only if you get the right HMO in the right compromise area. And compromise area means it's not the most expensive because the figures will never add up. And it's at a good price where you can make the figures work, but where you're getting decent quality tenants. Because unfortunately, if you have transient tenants, then there's no point in having a HMO, because you're going to end up with a lower return than a single let property. And how do you ensure you don't have transient tenants? Well, one of the main ways of doing that is making sure you have decent room sizes. And most of my room sizes would be about 10 square meters. Now, that's not a massive room, but it's not a small room either. And ideally, you want en suites where you can fit them. So you've got to treat tenants well, offer them good service, and they'll stay as long as possible. And, you know, good quality furnishings, soundproof, made to measure furniture, good quality mattresses is very important. And it's all about creating a positive, good quality living environment, you know, and you will find that tenants will stay a lot longer if they've got a comfortable mattress, if the bedroom is a decent size, if the property is furnished and it's attractive. And many landlords would say, you know, say to me, oh, I can't afford the services of an interior designer. Well, I would say it's worth the investment in, because you've kind of got to differentiate your property. You've kind of got to make it more attractive and more attractive than the competition. So, you know, HMOs do work if you get them in the right area. And if you make them attractive and comfortable for tenants, they will stay. So moving on to the next part is, I'm going to show you how to find what I would call undervalued properties. So how do we know a property is undervalued? Well, in my way of looking at it, it's all about house price to earnings ratios. So house price to earnings ratio is the average house price divided by the average income. And this way you can compare like for like, because what you don't want to be doing is just comparing, you know, London to the north, because obviously London to the north will be much cheaper. So the average ratio is about 8.8 or 9, I think it is now. So this means that if you have an area with a low house price to earnings ratio, the local population can afford to pay a higher percentage of their disposable income to a mortgage. So in practice, this means that even if there's no regeneration in an area, I would forecast that prices will go up in these areas in particular, simply because the local people can afford to pay a higher percentage of their disposable income towards a mortgage. And if you look at the slide there, we have obviously London up at the top, very expensive on a house price to earnings ratio. But the areas with the most growth in the future, I would guess, would be the northeast after the northwest. Northwest, Yorkshire and Humber, as you can see there. Wales is always very affordable. West Midlands is still very affordable. So this is going to be the areas that are going to grow in the future, simply on an affordability basis to local populations, as I've said before. So if we look further on at these slides as well, this just gives you an idea of some very affordable places to invest in the UK. So how do we actually find a HMO? Because the market is saturated at the moment. And the problem is everybody's looking for the same deals. And if you're going on Rightmove, you know, it's going to be a challenge to find deals. So some of the best deals I've done over the years is simply where I found real off-market deals, because it's not been on the market, by simply walking the streets. And what I would do is I would build up a list of all my target area, of all the empty or derelict properties suitable for residential conversion in my area. And I would go after the owners, because sometimes it takes years, you don't get in contact with the owner. Often the land reg details are out of date. So what you have to do is simply walk the streets, look for derelict properties to find the right HMO. And you've got lots of options for under permitted development, which I'm going to explain further on in the slides. So then you use the land registry, obviously, to find their information. And I'm going to show you a template of the typical letter I send on the next slide. You send them a letter, and what will often happen is the land reg will be out of date. So you've got to go online and search Facebook, LinkedIn. 192.com has an out of date electoral register there. Company's house, and really you're trying to trace them down, find the owners. Obviously speak to the neighbors is very powerful as well. They'll often know a bit of history. But when all else fails, I use different tracing agencies, and one of them is Vilcol, and they will charge you on a success basis, basically. So what you're basically looking to do is target properties that are not for sale, ideally derelict, so you can start again and reconfigure, make them highly insulated, very desirable properties. And you'll build up a list of properties in your area, and in order to communicate or contact the owners, what I would do is then send them a letter. It would be highly personalized, and this letter is given free as part of my training course that I run for the NRLA, and that training course is called The Key to Property Investment. You can see it on the left on the slide there. But generally speaking, direct to vendor, you have to write a very personalized letter and explain that you're interested in buying the property, and make sure the owner realizes that it's not just a general mail shot letter. So that's how to find properties not on the open market. But let's say, how do we find property on the open market when the property is already there? Well, obviously, Rightmove is the main search engine we use in the UK. So how do you actually use Rightmove? Okay, so if you look at that slide there, look at the words "in need of modernization." So I'll go back to the slide in a second. So when you go on Rightmove, you need to search in the keyword search facility, which is a new tool that Rightmove have launched, and search the word modernization or development potential. Now, there are 8 or 10 keywords, and at the end of this presentation, I'll give you my email address, and if anybody wants them, I'm happy to email the keywords that come up. So basically, you're looking to search specific properties with development potential using those keywords. Another very good source is Estates EIG. So EIG is the property auction platform in the UK. It's the biggest main property auction platform. 98% of all auctions go through this platform. So if you want to search the whole of the market for all auction properties in the UK, it's much more comprehensive than Rightmove. That will bring up everything that's for sale under the auctions. So there's only one other competitor to EIG, and that's a company called I Am Sold. And so they may also have results that are not on EIG. So if you can imagine, there's hundreds of different auction houses, and in your local area, there might be an auction house that you've never heard of before that's got a property in the auction in your local area. And EIG is the place where you find that information. So in terms of getting deals from estate agents, how do you get deals? Well, the obvious one would be you've got to build up relationships with estate agents, but how do you do that? And the best way I've found over the years is to simply give letting agents your business. Give them your letting business. There's usually 1 or 2 agents in any given area that have the best deals, and they tend to be the ones that have been the longest established. So if you target those agencies, get a relationship with the letting side, and then ask the letting people to introduce you formally and have a meeting with the sales team, and basically say to them, hi, I'm an investor, want to build a relationship with you. I want to be able to get access to some of your deals, because sometimes it's often a beauty parade where there's 2 or 3 investors looking for the same deal, and you want to be the one who gets the final call. It's also a good idea to have a good professional profile on LinkedIn, because often estate agents, if they don't know you well, they go on to LinkedIn and have a look at you. And then if it is a beauty parade and you seem like professional, you seem like an investor who can make the deal happen, then of course they may choose you first. So that's how you do the in need of modernization word for Rightmove. And then you can also set keyword alerts, so that, for example, you can set a keyword alert on Rightmove so that any property that comes up with those keywords in need of modernization, you'll get that directly to your inbox. And there's an example of it there. So all the properties in my area that come up with those keywords, I automatically get a notification. So I'm first off the mark to find those properties. That's a screenshot of EIG auctions. And when I'm also doing my comparables in terms of due diligence, and this is one of the biggest tip I can tell you today, and it's probably the #1 tip, and out of all the top 7 tips that I could give you, is that when I'm doing my comparables, I don't go on Rightmove, I go on EIG, because EIG is not out of date, whereas Rightmove is 4 to 5 months out of date. And all the recent sold price history from all the auctions all over the UK is out of date. So this is a very good place, not only to find property, but to search sold house price history. Another really good place is Property Link. This is a really good place to find deals. And the reason for this is because this lists all the commercial property for sale in the UK. The vast majority would be on here, more so than Rightmove. And you're targeting commercial property because they're the most likely property suitable for HMO conversion. And we're going to discuss HMO conversion further on in the slides. I'm going to show you some examples, and I'm going to discuss permitted developments, etc. Okay, so, you know, as mentioned before, you're looking to build a relationship with agents. How do you do that? Then you need to give the longest established agencies in your area your letting business. I'm not a big fan of dealing with online letting companies. There's no chance to build a relationship. You can't walk in and meet the people. So face-to-face always works best. And when I'm doing a deal, I teach this in my property investment course, the Key to Property Investment for the NRLA. I always say to people, you've got to make offers face-to-face and build rapport with people, because often people do business with people they like. And if they haven't met you, they can't get to like you, so to speak. Okay, so let's discuss HMOs and permitted development. Now, I know some of you will have lots of questions about these slides, so at the end of my presentation, we'll have lots of time to answer some questions. Okay, so let's discuss HMO. Where's the opportunity? If I could say to you, where's the biggest opportunity over the next few years? And what's the easiest way to get HMO permitted development opportunities? Well, we all know the office to residential market is failing at the moment. You know, you can see the figures. Offices, you know, it's a done deal now. We are working from home. Most of us will work from home for most days forever, basically. I don't think it's ever going to change. And if you look at the figures there, you know, the office occupancy rate has tumbled, basically. So what's going to happen as a result? Well, just one second now, my screen is just, here we go. So there is a bit of a crisis in the office market at the moment. And the Financial Times in December, they had said in the FT that basically they said, I'm quoting from them here, it's on my screen, from the FT, the commercial property values and rents are predicted to tumble off the cliff edge in the first quarter of 2023. Now, it hasn't happened yet, but prices are falling in commercial property, in offices in particular. And the biggest issue is a lot of these offices are getting refinanced, and they're struggling with the refinances because the loan to value is an issue now because the values have fallen so much. Another big issue in the media, which we're going to talk about on the slides as well, is the EPCs, because older buildings that don't meet new commercial environmental standards, they're really expensive to convert. So the cost of basically lowering the EPCs on these commercial buildings for big building is making them unviable. So that's just a bit more information about, you know, the values and the fall in the values of commercial property. And some of the real estate funds, the biggest real estate fund is Blackstone Real Estate Income Trusts, and they've actually stopped withdrawals in their trusts in recent months to stop investors pulling out. So there is a bit of a concern here. If there was going to be a property crash, it probably would be in this section of the property market, although the UK is better protected than the US market. I'm highlighting this just to show you that a lot of commercial property will be coming on the market suitable for development. Okay, so let's discuss permitted development. Permitted development makes life a lot easier. It simply means, for example, you could convert a HMO in your local area up to 6 rooms without formal planning application. I'm going to show you some examples in the slides further on. So permitted development is much easier than full planning applications. For somebody starting out, it would be the best route, easier, much simpler. You know, with permitted developments, you have architect's fees, you have various application fees, building control fees, asbestos surveys, etc., warranties, but it's much lower threshold than a full planning application, because if you can imagine, each full planning application for a new dwelling would be £462 alone. So it's a lot lower risk and easier to get into. So, for example, a house which is classified as C3 can be converted into a 6-bed HMO. So what that means is that you don't have to make a formal planning application. Now, that's assuming it's not what's called in an Article 4 area, which basically restricts this. So you can convert any house which is a C3 into 6 rooms. And you don't need planning permission, but you will need building regulations involved, etc., especially if you're doing some major works, etc. So it works out really well if you can buy the property in the right area. And remember, I discussed earlier on, what is the right area? It's a compromise area. It's going to be an area where the prices are not the top, but it's not the lowest area also, where you have decent quality tenants, etc. So this is just a general overview of the options. This is an example of a 6-bed HMO. This was originally a 4-bed, I think it was, and I turned it into a 6-bed. And I just simply put an extension out the back in the kitchen, and then I put an extension upstairs in the top in the attic. So effectively putting a box in the attic, etc. Now, remember as well, in the case of Liverpool, for example, you only need a HMO license for 5 people onwards, and that's in the case of Liverpool. So you could have a 4-bed, it's a HMO property, but it's not a licensable HMO. You will not need a license from the local housing, from the local council, basically. So that's just something to bear in mind in Liverpool. And I speak for Liverpool only because different councils have different restrictions and different planning rules, etc. So that's example as well. In terms of permitted development, another option would be that was an old shop in a parade of shops. That was in a failing parade of shops where the council are happy for the shops to be turned into residential. And if you look at that, the ground floor would have been done. That was done in a permitted development. I would have got what's called a change of use for the ground floor. And then in the upper floors, I would have got what's called a certificate of lawfulness. And that's basically a way of getting my planning sorted so that it's good for the lenders, etc., but without going in for a full planning application. Okay, old pubs as well, they're very good because you can get a change of use again. If you look here, change of use in the bottom, followed by a certificate of lawfulness on the upper floors. And it's a much simpler process in terms of getting through the planning, and it will make your life easier, and it's much lower risk. Again, that's the same pub as well. Now, we did actually do a further application for the basement, but that had to be a normal planning application for the basement to turn it into a dwelling. So in the case of this, often my developments, I will go in stages to get what I want in the end, because it's much easier to go in stages through permitted development than doing a formal planning application. And that's an example of the floor plan. I'm going to show you more examples of so when you're doing HMOs, this is a different property. You have to have furniture made to measure, because often the rooms are not going to be big, they're not going to be tiny. But if you make the furniture made to measure, for example, if you look at that table there, that's half the width of a normal table. That's 30 centimeters instead of 60. And then if you look at the left, the furniture, it's made to measure. The wardrobe is what's called an open wardrobe. And again, instead of a big bulky wardrobe, which would be massive in this room, it makes the room look a hell of a lot bigger. Now, I'm not saying small rooms, go for small rooms. I'm saying you have to go for compromise size rooms, which are still 10 square meters, which are still a decent size. So I'll just go through some of the images now. And that's some previous projects I've done, again, under permitted development. So what you'll often end up with is basically a bed on the wall room, which basically means, again, it's about 10 square meters, but you will have to put a bed on the wall. And that would be a typical room and bed I would have. So the other end of the room, it's a decent enough size, it's a good size storage, and the whole bed is a storage bed, and that's accessed by a special pull-up flap, and it's a normal divan bed, and I get them from a special hotel supplier. Okay, so, and that's some I've done in the past also. Try to make your properties good quality, high end, and you can do that sometimes without actually spending that much more. And I always try and use the services of an interior designer. Also, always try and brand my properties. You want to make it look professional, and you want to be that professional, because there's kind of no point in having a fancy brand if you offer really bad service to tenants, or if you don't reply to their calls, you know, promptly, or don't deal with maintenance issues, etc. So that would be a typical room. If you look on the left, the desk is high, and that's what's called a pull-up flap bed. So that bed, it's a flap and it pulls up, and they can put all their storage into that property. And in terms of how to fit out the detail of this, I teach all this on my NRLA training course, and it's just called property refurbishment. So if you search the words property refurbishment NRLA, you'll find me. Okay, so moving on, I'll show you some more slides of other properties. And that would be a typical room again. And that's about 10 square meters with an ensuite. And ideally, if you can do ensuites, it really, really helps. Okay, so just let's move on to... So this is a case study. This is an example of an old pub. I did get full planning permission for this, for a 15-bed HMO. And old pubs or old offices are absolutely ideal. This is back in the 1800s, believe it or not, when it was attached to another block of apartments on the left. So in the case of this, if you look where my mouse is here at the top, I got planning for another dwelling effectively in the roof space with the use of the... So basically, there's 4 floors, each one is a HMO, but in the case of this one, they're all 4 bedrooms, so I actually don't need a HMO license for each one. So with the use of dormers, I was able to get another floor into this building. And you're always looking for squeezing as many rooms as you can, but the caveat would be that actually you're not looking to make tiny rooms, which give a poor quality of life for tenants. So if you look at the floor plan there again, that's, you know, we've squeezed as many rooms as we can in, but they're still a decent size. And in order to create value, you really will have to find properties in derelict condition. And the more derelict, the better. And if you're not highly experienced, you know what? You can do challenging projects like this, but the caveat would be that you would have all the right team in place. You would have a structural engineer, you'd have your quantity surveyor, you'd have your builder, of course, you'd have your planner, etc. So that's the final product now. That's how it turned out. And that would be a typical project, because most of the projects I do would be in pretty poor condition. So we have about another 8 minutes left of these slides, and then I'm going to move on to questions, basically. Okay, so to summarize today, in terms of de-risking and protecting and giving you the top tip of all the tips, that has got to be get your front end right. Go and look at that checklist from slide 1, showing the checklist you need to go through before you issue a tenancy. Because if you haven't issued the tenancy correctly, in line with the endless legislation, which there is, unfortunately, you may struggle to issue Section 8 or Section 21. So just search the words NRLA checklist, and it will come up on the internet, or go directly onto the NRLA website. Now, I'm not going to discuss the details of every single thing you need to do for the checklist, because that's all available online. What I'm saying here, guys, is protect yourself, de-risk, and really do your due diligence as best as you can on tenants, new tenants. And also another thing I always do is I always ask tenants for the next of kin, and it must be a parent. And that way, if the tenant disappears, I've got a much better chance of contacting if I've got a parent's contact number. Because if you don't insist on that, when the tenant is filling out the application form and it says ask them for the details of the next of kin, then they can just put anybody there. And sometimes they just put anybody, and often they fall on that with a friend that they put on the next of kin by the time you need to contact them. Another big tip I would say is you've got to create value in every transaction. If you remember at the beginning of the slides, I said, are you retail or are you trade price? So I'm trade price. I create value in every deal. I do a refurbishment project, because that's the only way I can create equity in every deal. Because if I was an investor, then I would be buying a property ready-made and hoping the prices would go up, and hopefully they will go up, but we've no guarantee. So you've got to create equity in every transaction so you don't run out of cash. The other thing I would say is you've got to prepare for EPC legislation. I'm going to show you a slide shortly about EPC. You've got to be ready for EPC because it could be costly if you're not ready. And you've got to build relationship with agents who can hopefully give you the right development potential deals. And how do you build relationships with agents? You give them your business, you give them your letting business, and then you get the lettings team to introduce you to the sales team. So, and remember that, you know, HMOs work really well, but you've got to have the correct room size, decent quality property, and then you won't have high tenant turnover. You won't have high churn, because a lot of people say to me, oh, HMOs are extra maintenance, extra hassle. Believe it or not, in my case, I find they're not. But I have my properties in the right area with the right room size. They're highly desirable, they're well maintained, they're reasonably decent sized rooms. So I'm offering a really good product, basically. Okay, so let's move on to EPCs. How do you prepare for EPCs? Okay, so EPCs are going to be costly. Nobody knows exactly how the legislation will pan out because it seems to be the government seems to be changing their mind a lot. But basically, we do know we will have to insulate our properties better. So at the moment, if your property already has a EPC, go on the EPC register and read it, and it will tell you what you will need to do to improve it. But let's assume you haven't got that. Then the best thing is to contact your local EPC assessor. Just type in the words EPC assessor on the internet and ask them to come out and do what's called a pre-audit. And a pre-audit is basically you're asking their advice. You're not asking them to do the actual EPC. You're going to say to them, listen, I will pay you an extra fee. Can you just come out and do an audit and give me some advice as to what I will need to get a really good EPC? Now, the other option is that you get an EPC consultant who will specialize in this area. And for anybody who wants to know an EPC consultant who can advise them on that, if you drop me an email or contact me on LinkedIn, etc., I will send you the name of a gentleman that I've used in the past called James Tanner. So there are various experts around that can help you as well, especially if you've got bigger portfolio, you need to speak to a consultant. So what you'll need to do then is get a quote for all the works, obviously. And if it's over 30,000 in works, then you need to get a quantity surveyorian to give you a proper quote and break it down professionally. Otherwise, you know, you're putting yourself at risk dealing with a builder. And as I said earlier on, if you're doing any project, I would never speak to a builder for an estimate. I always get the work done. All the estimates are done with my quantity surveyor first. You can also get free advice on energy saving trusts. But you do need a specialist, you know, to give you advice about what's the best way to do it. And there are a few options which I'm going to discuss on the next slide. So if it's a new build as well, you'll need to do what's called a SAP calculation. Sorry, I can't get my words out. So SAP calculation, basically, what is a SAP calculation? So a SAP calculation, this is for new dwellings. So it's a desktop exercise for a client and their designer. So what you do is you're going to give your SAP expert your plans, your drawings, etc. And he will basically come up with an assessment. And your SAP calculation is basically the methodology behind your EPC. It's essentially a thorough list of calculations to judge the overall performance of a building. So the SAP assessment might say to you, for example, the only way we can get to a C rating is by installing solar panels. And that will tell you all that before you start the building. And that's why it's important. And it's also part of building regulations now, so it has to be done. So your SAP expert it's doing the calculation, he might ask you for, you know, the plans. He will ask for the type of ventilation system, the boiler system, etc., the size of the water cylinder. He'll want details of secondary, of the glazing, etc., and he will basically come up with the right formula. So then you can get a much lower EPC. So he's the same effectively as a consultant who will come and assess your property and advise you on how to get a higher EPC. Okay, so typical options would be, you know, I'm not an expert in EPCs, but this is what I know people are doing is, you know, get a radiator valve, get a TRV so that you can control the radiators, for example. LED lights, obviously, a two-channel program boiler as well, which means you can zone off your house. You could have just upstairs off if you're not, you know, on the upstairs. And obviously things like loft insulation is really cheap. Cavity wall insulation is the thing I've done most over the years. It is expensive, but it does a really good job. And it simply means you're putting a block of insulation, usually on all the walls that will front the front and the back, you know, the external walls on the inside. So there are other options of solar panels, which I haven't done and know nothing about, and heat panels, again, which I haven't done and know nothing about, but they're also expensive. So, you know, in my case with HMOs, I control my heating via a thermostat and also Inspire controls. And thermostat is basically, it's a thermostat where the tenants physically have to press it every 4 hours to keep putting the heat on. And that means that they're not going to leave the heat on overnight. But in my case, where it's bills included, I always focus on buying products with good efficiency rating, especially if the things that are always on, like the fridge and the TV, for example. So that's just a general overview of EPC. Again, I'm not an expert in this area, but I can tell you what other people are doing, etc. And okay, so we're going to finish up. In terms of the how to rent guide, that's been updated for those of you who don't know. So there is a requirement for those of you who don't know it's called the how to rent guide, and you have to issue this as part of a new tenancy. I think most of you probably already know this, but that's been updated in March, and there's a requirement now for carbon monoxide alarms should be fitted in every room where there's a fixed burning appliance. EIC ORs must now be provided to tenants. And the guide also states that a 5-year-old electrical safety check must be organised by the landlord. However, the new guide specifically states that it must be by a qualified, competent person. And what it's saying there is that it must be done by an electrician, basically, with the appropriate qualifications. So there's also new guidance in terms of ensuring your property is suitable for people with disabilities, which is really welcome. And there's also mandatory requirements on smoke alarms and monoxide alarms, etc., etc. But again, that's just an overview. There are some more updates, and you can just simply search how to rent guide updates, and the information will come up on the NRLA website. So basically, we're nearly finished now. We're going to move on to questions. Going to put up this side. This is my contact details, and I also present the key to property investment on behalf of the NRLA. So that's on a 20% sale at the moment also. So Megan, I think we're basically finished now for the slides. We can go to questions if that's okay.
Great, yeah, we've had a couple in. So can I find out if my property falls under the Article 4 restriction?
Okay, well, some local councils will have a postcode map finder on the local council website. In the case of Liverpool, they don't have an accurate map. So the only way you would truly know for sure is to actually email the planning department and get an email. And in some cases, your lender will actually ask you for that. So if it was me personally, I still wouldn't trust what I would read on their website. I would want an official email from somebody in the planning department confirming that my exact address of my exact property is definitely not in an Article 4 area. That's the only way you can know for sure.
Great. Next up, do you recommend any resources to make sure the property is in an area of natural beauty or conservation area when looking for properties to purchase?
Well, if property is in a conservation area, it does restrict the options in terms of what you're allowed to do. And again, there is a database. Your local council will have a list of all the postcodes which are in a conservation area. Now, conservation area, it doesn't mean it's still not a good option for HMOs. You know, you will still be able to get planning, but it will be a bit more restrictive. And what you'll find with conservation areas are often the nicer areas as well. So ideally, you want to be in those nicer areas if you can afford to be. So, but yeah, there are options, but you've got to be a bit more careful with it being a conservation area for sure.
Great, thank you.
So yeah, thank you, Megan. If anybody has any inquiries about anything, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. Also, that's my email address. I think I have. No, I haven't got my email address up there. So, but you'll get me on those social media on the usual places. So Megan, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.